possible.
I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston. As the debt ceiling deadline approaches, the former president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas joins me on the consequences if lawmakers fail to reach a deal, the rolling banking crisis, and how all of it will affect the already strained U.S. economy. Then, Ukraine's president is promising a counteroffensive to liberate his country from Russian occupation. Two experts join me on his chances of success and how Putin may react. Time is running out for Congress and President Biden to reach a deal to raise the debt ceiling before the country defaults on its loans for the first time in modern American history. The federal government officially reached its borrowing limit back in January, and the Treasury Department has been using accounting tools known as extraordinary measures to keep paying the nation's bills. But Secretary Janet Yellen warns the department could run out of emergency options and start missing payments as early as June 1st. Which could have catastrophic consequences for the U.S. and global economies, and forever damage the rock-solid reputation of Treasury bonds around the world. Neither party wants that to happen, but Republicans in Congress are insisting on a series of future spending cuts in exchange for their votes on a debt ceiling increase, while Democrats, led by President Biden, want to pass the increase clean.
I remain optimistic because I'm a congenital optimist. But I really think there's a desire on their part as well as ours to reach agreement. I think we'll be able to do it.
I still think we're far apart. It doesn't seem to me yet that they want it. It just seems that they want to look like they're in a meeting, but they're not. They're not talking anything serious.
Negotiations are set to start back up again tomorrow. But as you just heard, prognoses are mixed about whether or not Democratic and Republican leaders will be able to make some kind of deal. Joining me to discuss is Robert Stephen Kaplan, the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas from 2015 until 2021. He's also former vice chairman of the Goldman Sachs Group and a former professor and associate dean at Harvard Business School. Rob, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
So Rob, if the U.S. were to default, what would happen?
So I must tell you the best way I think to think about this is actually we're not going to default. Neither side wants to default, and we're not going to default. I wouldn't surprise me if this goes down to the 11th hour where you furlough employees and you may shut down some public facilities, but we're not going to default. And I actually think for your viewers, my best observation would be don't pay attention as much to the tactics and the debate about the 14th Amendment and all that, and focus more on the idea we have deficits approaching $2 trillion right now. Debt to GDP is in excess of 100%, and we haven't even gone into a downturn. We're probably going to go into one. We actually need more fiscal restraint. And so I think the focus on tactics and whether or not we're going to default, the energy may be better spent on actually the idea that we do need some spending discipline in order to have a healthier economy and a healthier future.
So, Rob, let me just push you on that a little bit, because I don't think we're going to default. I certainly hope we won't default, but I think it's important for viewers to understand why it is so important that we don't do so.
So a default literally means we don't make an interest payment on the debt, okay? I would guess, and it's going to be painful to watch, that you'll get till June and theoretically we don't have enough money to pay all our bills. What the government will start to do is allocate to where it cuts back, but the last thing it's going to do is not make an interest payment. Probably the second to last thing it's not going to do is pay Social Security. If God forbid we ever didn't make an interest payment, to your point, it would undermine the financeability of the United States. And we've got to understand, we run a very high degree of leverage in the United States. The only reason we're able to get away with it is the dollar's the world's reserve currency, because people think in times of stress, this is the safest place to be. It's vital that we don't undermine that.
So to take that out of sort of the language of the financial sector, Rob, what I think you're saying is right now the United States has sort of a perfect credit rating. And if we default once where it, as if we'd missed a payment on the mortgage or missed a payment on our credit cards, it's not just that we missed that payment, it's that the payments we make forever afterwards will be vastly more expensive.
That's exactly right. But I would caution there's a reason for this standoff. And that is if we keep going and spending the way we are right now, I think, first of all, fiscal policy is right now at cross purposes with monetary policy. Monetary policy is trying to slow the economy and cool inflation. I think fiscal spending is stimulating the economy and stimulating inflation. And increasingly, China is talking to Brazil, OPEC, about denominating payments away from the dollar. We actually need to get our house in order because not tomorrow, but I'm afraid over the next 10 or 15 years, if we don't improve our fiscal discipline, we will have a different kind of problem, which will be just as troubling as the default scenario we just talked about, and that people will start finding alternatives to the dollar, and we won't be the world's reserve currency. And I think if there's some stress right now to avoid that later, I think that would be useful stress to go through right now.
So, Rob, let me ask you, this feels almost like a game theory problem, right? That what's forcing them to come to agreement is the threat of what will happen if they don't. But if no one believes that that threat is real, then there's not actually a lot of pressure for them to come to an agreement.
That's right. And the reality is, what we have going for us, I think the thought of a default is so unthinkable to either side that I have a funny feeling they're going to come to an agreement, and they need to have some type of agreement. But yes, this is a game of chicken. It's not healthy. I think it's distracting. We've got a lot of other issues in this country, including a banking situation that's challenging. And I think the energy should be put more into how do we build this nation, improve productivity, education, skills training, a whole range of other very critical priorities. But I think fiscal discipline is important.
So, Rob, just to make sure, that is it that unthinkable? We had the former president of the United States and the leading contender for the Republican nomination for president of the United States just 2 days ago say that he thought we should default, and he went encouraging the Congress to do that. Given that his level of power and influence, I have to ask, is it really as unlikely as you've told us it is?
I think it's extraordinarily unlikely, and I think the person you're referring to who said we should just go ahead and have a default, he doesn't want to have a default either, and I can tell you he does not want to be responsible for a default. He might like them to go further out in playing out this game of chicken than you or I would, but he doesn't want a default either, and believe me, if it ever got to that point, I think he would probably feel compelled to step in and encourage them to settle this so there isn't a default.
So there is one technical fix that I can't resist the chance to ask you about, Rob, because I've never seen anyone else raise it, which is perpetual bonds. Perpetual bonds, because the principal is never repaid, do not actually count against the debt ceiling, and they are within the statutory authority of the Secretary of the Treasury to issue. So if we were to start issuing them, we would essentially obviate the debt ceiling crisis immediately, but no one's even mentioning it as a possibility. Do you think it is a valid idea? And if so, should we start doing it?
I would hope that we spend very little energy on that idea. We could still have a default even with that, just by not making an interest payment. That would create a default. That's the more likely way for the default to occur. It's not that we don't repay debt, it's that we don't make an interest payment. I think the energy should be instead on actually keeping pressure on both sides to each move and do things they'd prefer not to do. And my only concern is about these deep debates on the 14th Amendment and newfangled financial ideas is I think the energy is not well placed in that we actually do have a legitimate problem. Inflation in this country right now is still around 5%, and I actually am very skeptical it can get much below 4% unless you have fiscal policy working along with monetary policy. And 50 million families today cannot make their ends meet. So we're threatening default at the federal level, but I can tell you 50 million families there who make $50,000 a year or less are struggling to how they pay their bills and are making some very tough trade-offs. We need to have a real fiscal discussion, and I think that's where the energy ought to be placed.
So amazingly, this isn't even the only economic crisis we're dealing with right now, because we're also dealing with a rolling banking crisis as a series of banks have gone under. Do you see this continuing, and does it point to a systemic failure in our banking system?
I think the issue is that there is a very uneven playing field between big banks and small banks. And the irony of it is we came out of the Great Recession saying, you know, we're not going to allow too big to fail. We're going to try to limit the size of the biggest banks, and we've just gone backwards on that objective. If I run a company and I have $1 million or $2 million payroll account, I would rather have that account at JP Morgan than my local bank, and it is critical to the 4,100 and some odd small mid-sized banks in this country that they're able to attract those payroll accounts, but they can't because treasurers, even though they're loyal to the bank, want to protect their money.
So Rob, we have these 4,000 banks. In fact, the state of North Dakota has more banks than the entire country of Canada. The U.S. has more banks than any other country in the world. Does that actually make sense? Should we have so many small banks, sort of uniquely of any major economy?
So it's very interesting. So you have to go back to Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wanted a small number of banks, but very concentrated. Jefferson was worried about central control and wanted more decentralization. The country went Jefferson's way, not Hamilton's. And so we developed a sprawling banking system. And you may remember until 20, 30 years ago, we didn't even allow interstate bank mergers, okay? And so the system has emerged to have lots of small, mid-sized banks who make small business loans. Canada, as you said, has 80 banks, but lots of branches. But I think it's fair to say that the culture of entrepreneurship here and the ease for a small restaurant or business to get a credit line is probably more available here than in that country. It's part of the fabric of the United States in that you've got these small banks that tailor their loan books to local businesses and local economies. And you may have read stories about a local bank that caters to the Amish and has to give a different kind of loan because the big bank would never do it. I think that's the nature of our system. And so we have to accept that at this point. If we were going to destroy those X thousand banks, you would go for a period where it would be very hard to get a loan if you're a small, mid-sized business.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Gautam.
Next, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky promises a counteroffensive is imminent, assuring world leaders and his fellow Ukrainians that they will liberate areas occupied by Russia. The promise comes after a several-city European trip to shore up support and new military aid from leaders in Italy, France, Germany, and the UK.
We're real partners. This support, it will help us to be more strong.
After months of heavy fighting, Ukraine's military have started to push Russian troops out of the eastern city of Bakhmut, a setback the Kremlin has acknowledged. And Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive is expected to include areas in the Crimean Peninsula and parts of eastern Ukraine that were under Russian control before their February 2022 invasion. Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky says victory is closer than ever. But, to put it mildly, Russian President Vladimir Putin is not known for fighting fair, or losing with grace, prompting fears of yet more human rights abuses, including the use of chemical weapons. To discuss, I'm joined by retired Army Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, a former defense attaché to Russia, now a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Carol Savitz, a senior advisor for MIT's Security Studies program and research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Carol, why don't you get us started?
Sure.
When should we expect this Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Well, that's been the big question for the last several weeks at least. Zelensky seems to be stalling. Last week he made a statement that said that when they're ready, they will do it. They're waiting for more arms and ammunition from the West. And then he said something today apparently about the weather, so I gather it's still a little muddy in Ukraine, so I think it's coming. But he did, since you mentioned Bakhmut, he did say that they are continuing the fight in Bakhmut to prevent Russian soldiers from redeploying to the other areas where they do intend to direct the offensive.
Kevin, when this happens, what's it going to look like?
Well, there's a number of ways that the Ukrainians could mount a counteroffensive. They could do it in Bakhmut region or the Donetsk province if they wanted to fight back there. I think there is a logic that says that they will rather work in the south where there has been fighting continuing on now, but if they can disrupt or create a break in this land corridor along the Azov Sea, which unites mainland Russia with Crimea. If they can break that with an operation in the south, that will do a number of things strategically for them, and it would be a great victory for them. A partial victory in their eyes, because total victory for them is getting rid of all Russian troops.
So if this counteroffensive, even if it succeeds, what is the Ukrainian theory of victory, given this disparity in forces? Is there expectation that the Russian army will collapse or something else?
Well, if you're asking me, the Ukrainian theory of victory has been repeated often by the president and the senior military leaders, so I think we have to take them at their word. Their theory of victory is something which is very, in most people's opinions, is almost unattainable, and that is a complete push out of Russian troops from all the former Ukrainian territory. In other words, Ukraine as it was back in 2013, in charge of Crimea, in charge of Donetsk and Lugansk, and so on.
Carol,
this is a big theory.
I think a more likely scenario, if at all feasible, would be a pushback to the 2014 lines that Kevin just referred to. I think that that's more realistic, if indeed it's realistic at all. You said something in your lead-in about Crimea. I see them, what they're doing now is, bombing oil depots and attacking, trying to prevent the Russians from staging in Crimea and countering the southern offensive. I don't know that they can retake Crimea either, as much as they would like to.
So almost every estimate for the beginning of the war vastly underestimated the Ukrainians and overestimated the Russian performance.
Right.
I think that's sort of been our consistent theme of the first year of the war. But the casualties have been astonishing. If we could put up on the screen, as of March 2023, Ukraine has suffered somewhere between 124,000 and 131,000 casualties. Russia, as many as 223,000. Just to put that in comparison, the number of soldiers each side had before the invasion, Ukraine had just under 200,000 and Russia had around 900,000. These are significant fractions of the total military establishment of the country. I mean, as a fraction of their armies, it's much a larger fraction than anything the United States has suffered in any conflict in its entire history.
Right.
What does that tell us about the ability of the two sides to keep fighting at this level of intensity for months or years going forward?
I think that's a great question, and I don't think we really know the answer. As Zelensky said, I think in Britain today, we're much more motivated than the Russians are to keep fighting, so I think that they have the ability to sustain some of these casualties for longer. The Russians are talking about a second mobilization, which the first one didn't go so well, but a second mobilization, and they seem more poorly prepared to counter the suspected, long-awaited Ukrainian offensive, although they have dug in lines. There have been pictures in the media of especially lines in Crimea and trenches, and it's beginning to look much more like World War I than anything else we've ever seen.
Including artillery expenditures, which has looked something like out of World War I as well. So Kevin, given what we've seen so far, do you expect the Russians to have the military capacity to be able to defend against a Ukrainian thrust?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, they can defend, but maybe not successfully along all the front line. You've put your finger on the major learning lesson for the United States and the rest of the world, and that is that This is the first major power war for the 21st century, and the high intensity of this war is a lesson for all of us. Nobody is ready for these kinds of losses, much less Ukraine, but even the United States would not be fully prepared for this. I think that we'll continue to have this kind of a stalemate situation where it's a stalemate in effect, but with small movement on either side of the line over time. And this is maybe the most probable or plausible situation moving forward.
I completely agree that this is really a war of attrition at this point. If you look at what's been happening in Bakhmut, it's block by block, corner by corner. The Russians are still holding the center of the town, whereas the Ukrainians are making advances along the edges. I don't see any major breakthroughs. I don't see another Kharkiv offensive the way we had last fall either. I think that the Russians are better prepared to wage a defensive war, and the Ukrainians are lacking in the ammunition and maybe even in the manpower, as you alluded to continue a major offensive forward.
So if the Ukrainian offensive is successful, I think the great fear for everyone else is that this will lead to Russian escalation even further, right? And there's been constant allusions to nuclear weapons by the Russian government, by figures in the Russian media at a level that is sort of, I'd say, not normal.
Right.
And then the possibility that's been raised recently of chemical weapons. Is that a realistic possibility? And if it is, what can we do to forestall it?
I don't know what we can do to forestall it. You know, Kevin knows even better than I. The Russian nuclear doctrine says escalate to de-escalate, and when there's an existential threat. But it's not clear in the doctrine whether it's an existential threat to Putin himself or to Russia, even if it's a conventional assault on Moscow. So that's why Putin has been threatening the nuclear weapons. But my hunch is that a lot of it is bluff. I mean, why move tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus? They could just as easily use Kaliningrad or Belgorod or some of the areas along the border. An interesting side note, Lukashenko's apparently been ill and has not been seen in over a week. So that's another factor to consider in here. I think that, you know, short of using nuclear weapons, as you allude to, he could either use chemical or biological weapons. The danger there is, of course, that would also affect the Russian troops on the ground and not just the Ukrainian forces. I think we have to be wary of that. And I actually think the Biden administration has done a very good job of actually not providing certain kinds of weapons that the Ukrainians have been looking for fear of that next step in the escalatory staircase.
So, Kevin, or how would we, if in the case of, let's say, a use of chemical weapons by the Russians, what would an American response look like?
Well, let me stay on the more, I think, on the track that Carol had us on, which is that you know, I think she's right that in general, you could say that the use of a nuclear weapon, a weapon of mass destruction, I'm going to put aside chemical weapons for the very reason that Carol mentioned a second ago, that would be much more dangerous even to the Russian troops. But a nuclear weapon would be a game changer for this war, but it would also be something that the Russians could control if you can control a nuclear weapon. The problem is here that if Ukraine escalates the war and Putin wants to escalate from his side and he cannot do that conventionally, then he has to turn to nuclear weapons. I think that the odds of a nuclear weapon are greater today than they were when this war started. And I personally believe that the odds are greater than 50% if this Ukrainian counteroffensive has any success really at all and threatens the land corridor or Russian holdings in Donetsk, much less Crimea. So I think the nuclear weapon is a major issue for us now. What we do is we begin to prepare to operate in a world where the nuclear genie is out of the bottle.
Carol, do you agree with that assessment?
I think I'm not as pessimistic as Kevin is about the use of nuclear weapons. I still think that there'd be a lot of pushback. Look, Xi Jinping, we know, has said to Putin, do not, under any circumstances, use nuclear weapons. So I think Putin has to weigh the quasi-alliance with China with his desire to use tactical nuclear weapons in the field in Ukraine. And for the moment, I think he's going to pick the Chinese side and hope that China continues to back him as opposed to using nuclear weapons, because then they really become a rogue pariah state.
Do you, I guess what I'd say is, if that's his concern, do you think he's more concerned about the consequences for regime survival of his losing the war, or becoming even more of a pariah state than they already are?
That's a great question. I think that I don't think he cares as much about being the pariah state as he would about losing power. I think then the question that we have to talk about is how dangerous is a Russia without Putin, and what happens internally within Russia. My fear is that the next person who succeeds Putin, however he leaves the scene, could be just as aggressive, if not more nationalistic or chauvinistic than is Vladimir Putin. Putin still seems to have some kind of rational balance in there. I'm not sure about the next guy.
So, with that as a concern, are there steps that we should be taking that we haven't to try and control these risks and minimize the odds of first use of nuclear weapons by the Russians?
Yes, there are steps we can take. I mean, we are communicating with Russia. We are telling them that they should not use nuclear weapons. Secretary Blinken and the president have made that clear. They've told us, without telling us the specifics, they've told us that they've warned Russia about that. But I think that it may not have an effect on Russia if Putin thinks his regime is in crisis or in a survival mode. So there's not really much we can do at this point to prevent Russia from using a nuclear weapon. So we ought to be thinking about what do we do in the case the day after, if you will. And some of that thinking should be about how our relationship is going to change with Russia then, that many of the things that we're bound by now, treaties and agreements and protocols from the past, will be gone. And so maybe we want to have a regime change in Russia then. Maybe we want to support Ukraine to the level that it will allow defeat of the Russian army. Those are the kinds of things that should be on the table for us.
Well, on that sobering note, Carol, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gautam.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Gautam Mukunda. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Next time on Antiques